The rain wasn't gentle that Saturday morning. It came down hard, slanting sideways in cold sheets that soaked through jackets and turned sidewalks into shallow rivers. Most people stayed inside, curled up with coffee and dry socks, but she couldn't afford that luxury. Not with rent due in 3 days and a toddler who'd woken up coughing again last night. She stood near the edge of the downtown market, just outside the covered stalls where vendors sold fresh bread, honey, and handmade soap. Her spot had no roof, no shelter, just a folding table she'd borrowed from a neighbor and 2 plastic buckets filled with flowers. The blooms weren't perfect. Some petals curled at the edges, others drooped from too much water or not enough care, but they were real, and they were all she had. Her little girl sat in a stroller wrapped in a bright yellow rain poncho 2 sizes too big, her tiny hands clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. She'd fallen asleep an hour ago, lulled by the steady drum of rain on the plastic tarp her mom had rigged over the stroller. Every few minutes the woman glanced over, checking her breathing, making sure she wasn't shivering. The stroller's wheels were caked in mud, and one of the brakes squeaked when she pushed it. But it rolled, and that was enough. She adjusted her own thin coat, the one with the frayed cuffs and a small tear near the pocket. She'd tried to stitch shut with dental floss. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, but she didn't bother brushing it away. There were more important things, like keeping the flowers from drowning. She'd propped an old umbrella on a stick tied to the table, but the wind kept knocking it sideways. Twice she'd had to chase after it as it tumbled down the street like a runaway jellyfish. People hurried past, heads down, collars turned up. A few glanced at her table but kept walking. One man paused, looked at the price tag, $3 for a small bouquet, and shook his head before vanishing into the crowd. She didn't blame him. $3 felt like a lot when you were counting every coin. She knew that better than anyone. Earlier that week, she'd gone to the back door of a fancy flower shop downtown. The owner, a woman with sharp eyes and red nails, had let her take the unsold arrangements from yesterday's weddings: roses with bruised edges, lilies starting to brown, baby's breath that smelled faintly of mildew. "Take 'em before I toss 'em," she'd said, not unkindly, but with the kind of tired efficiency that came from running a business in a city that never slowed down. She'd loaded them into a grocery cart she'd found abandoned near the bus stop, wheeling it 10 blocks in the drizzle, careful not to let the stems snap. Back home, a single room above a laundromat that smelled like detergent and damp concrete, she'd spent hours trimming stems, soaking wilted blooms in ice water, separating the salvageable from the ruined. She'd wrapped the good ones in newspaper she'd smoothed out with her hands, tied them with twine from a hardware store sample bin. No fancy ribbons, no glossy tags, just flowers offered with quiet hope. Now, standing in the rain, she watched a woman in a bright blue raincoat stop a few feet away. She had a reusable tote bag slung over her shoulder and was scrolling on her phone. For a moment, the flower seller held her breath, but the woman didn't look up. She stepped around a puddle and kept walking. A gust of wind sent rain stinging into her eyes. She blinked it away, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and forced a small smile at a couple who slowed near her table. They exchanged a look, then shook their heads and moved on. She didn't take it personally. Rainy days were always slow, but slow meant no money. And no money meant no groceries, no medicine for that cough, maybe not even lights next week if she couldn't scrape together the bill. She glanced at her daughter again. Still asleep, good. At least she wasn't cold. The little one had been so brave lately, eating plain rice without complaining, playing quietly with crayons while her mom filled out job applications on the library computer. She'd even tried to help by folding laundry, though most of it ended up on the floor. But she tried, and that was everything. By early afternoon, the rain hadn't let up. Her fingers were numb, her socks squelched in her shoes, and the table was slick with water. She'd sold 2 bouquets, one to a teenager buying flowers for his grandma, another to a nurse who said, "You're out here in this? Bless your heart," before pressing a $5 bill into her hand and refusing change. That $5 felt like a lifeline. When the market officially closed at 2 p.m., most vendors packed up quickly, eager to get dry. She took her time. She couldn't afford to lose a single stem. She carefully placed the unsold flowers into a plastic bin, covered them with a towel, and tucked the bin under the stroller. Then she folded the table, tied the legs with a bungee cord, and began the long walk home. The stroller bumped over cracked pavement. Her arms ached from pushing and carrying. Rain dripped off the brim of her hood. Her daughter stirred, mumbled something in her sleep, and snuggled deeper into the poncho. Back in their room, she lifted the little girl out of the stroller and carried her to the narrow bed they shared. She peeled off wet clothes, wrapped her in a dry towel, and tucked her under a quilt patched with fabric from old shirts. Only then did she let herself sit on the floor back against the wall and count what she'd made. $7.35. She stared at the coins in her palm. Quarters, dimes, a few pennies stuck together with moisture. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it was something. She thought about the nurse's kind eyes, the teenager's shy smile, the way her daughter had hugged her that morning and whispered, "You pretty, Mama," before they left the house. She walked to the tiny sink, filled a pot with water, and set it on the hot plate. When it boiled, she dropped in 2 packets of instant noodles, the cheap kind with too much salt but enough warmth to fill an empty stomach. As the steam rose, she looked out the window. The rain still fell steady and gray, washing the city clean. She didn't cry. Not yet. Crying wouldn't pay the rent. But later, after the noodles were eaten and her daughter was breathing softly in sleep, she sat on the edge of the bed, head in her hands, and let the quiet tears come. They weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of exhaustion, of love, of a heart stretched thin but still beating. Outside, the city hummed with distant traffic and dripping eaves. Inside, in that small room above the laundromat, there was only the sound of rain and the quiet promise that tomorrow she'd try again. The next Saturday came just as wet as the last, maybe even colder. She stood in the same spot, same thin coat, same buckets of rescued flowers. Her daughter sat bundled in the stroller again, this time chewing on a teething biscuit and watching pigeons strut through puddles like they owned the place. Business had been even slower than before. People were staying home, or maybe they'd just stopped noticing her. She was about to pack up early. What was the point of staying if no one was buying? When an older woman approached, she wore a long dark coat with a scarf wrapped neatly around her neck and carried a canvas tote with Chinese characters stitched along the side. Her steps were slow but sure, like someone used to moving through the world without rushing. She stopped in front of the flower table and didn't say anything at first. Just looked. Not at the price tags, not at the seller, but at the flowers themselves, really looked. She picked up a small bunch of pink carnations, turned them gently in her hands, then set them down. "How much for all of it?" she asked, her voice calm with a soft accent that sounded like home and tea and quiet mornings. The flower seller blinked. "All of it?" "Yes, everything left." She glanced at the buckets, maybe 24 stems, mostly past their prime, some with petals starting to fall. $10? She offered, half expecting the woman to laugh or walk away. The woman didn't hesitate. She pulled a worn leather wallet from her coat, counted out a 10 and a 5, and handed over the bills. 15. Keep the change. Before the flower seller could thank her, the woman pointed to the stroller. "Your little one is shivering." She hadn't even noticed. But sure enough, her daughter's lips were slightly blue at the edges. Her tiny fingers curled tight around her rabbit. "Come," the woman said, nodding toward a narrow storefront just down the block with warm light glowing in the window and the faint scent of ginger and cinnamon drifting out. "You both need dry socks." She hesitated. Strangers made her careful. Life had taught her that kindness often came with strings. But the cold had seeped into her bones and her daughter's eyes were drooping with tiredness. So she pushed the stroller toward the little shop. Inside, it was like stepping into another world. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars of dried herbs, loose-leaf teas, and honey in amber bottles. A small kettle whistled on a back burner. The air was warm, dry, and smelled like comfort. The woman, she never gave her name, but the flower seller would come to think of her as Auntie, brought over 2 mugs of hot ginger tea, a plate of steamed buns, and a thick towel. She knelt beside the stroller and, without asking, unwrapped the little girl's wet socks and rubbed her feet gently until color returned to her toes. "You have good hands," Auntie said suddenly, watching as the flower seller smoothed a crumpled petal back into place on a drooping rose. "But you're fighting the wrong battle." The flower seller looked up, confused. "You're trying to sell flowers like everyone else," Auntie continued, pouring more tea. "But your gift isn't just the flowers. It's the care you put into them. Even the broken ones, you treat them like they still matter." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Over the next few weeks, Auntie became a quiet presence every Saturday. She'd arrive mid-morning with a thermos of tea, sit on a folding stool beside the flower table and talk, not about money or success, but about how certain flowers bloom best after rain, how wilted stems can perk up if you cut them underwater, how people remember how you made them feel long after they forget what you sold them. She also taught her tricks, how to revive nearly dead lilies with ice water and aspirin, how to tie bouquets with twine so they held their shape, how to arrange colors so they didn't clash but sang together. People don't buy flowers just to look at, Auntie said one day, adjusting a sprig of eucalyptus. They buy them to feel something: hope, love, peace, even grief. Your job isn't to sell petals, it's to hold space for what's in their hearts. Slowly, things began to shift. She started waking before dawn, not just to collect discarded flowers, but to visit wedding venues and event halls. She'd wait near the service entrance, polite and patient, and ask if they had any arrangements they were about to throw away. Most said yes. Some even began saving them for her. Back in her room, she'd sort through the bounty: roses with bent stems, orchids with one bloom left, ferns still green but no longer needed. She'd trim, soak, reshape. She began using old newspaper from the laundromat's recycling bin to wrap bouquets, smoothing each sheet with her palms until it looked intentional, not desperate. She found colorful scraps of fabric at a thrift store for 50 cents and cut them into thin ribbons. One Saturday, she wrote a small note on the back of a receipt. For someone who needs a little light today. She tucked it into a bouquet of sunflowers and white daisies and placed it on the edge of her table with a sign: "Pay what you can." A young man in a delivery uniform stopped, read the note, and left $2 in a folded piece of paper that said, "My mom passed last week." "Thank you." Her throat tightened. She hadn't expected that. More people started stopping, not just to buy, but to talk. An elderly man came every week for a single red carnation, for my wife's grave. A college student bought lavender sprigs to tuck into her textbooks during exams. A woman with tired eyes whispered, "These remind me of my garden back home." Before walking away with a small bunch of marigolds, she began remembering faces. She'd save a sprig of mint for the nurse who'd bought flowers weeks ago. She'd set aside the brightest daisies for the little girl who came with her grandfather every other Saturday. One rainy afternoon, Auntie didn't come. The flower seller waited, glancing down the street, but the tea shop's sign was dark. A neighbor later told her Auntie had gone to stay with family out of state. For a while, they said, though her eyes suggested it might be longer. She missed her deeply. But she kept going. She tied bouquets the way Auntie taught her. She spoke gently to customers. She made sure her daughter always had dry socks. And then, something unexpected happened. A woman with a camera and a bright yellow raincoat stopped at her table. She introduced herself as someone who wrote about small local businesses. She took a few photos of the flowers, of the handwritten notes, of the little girl coloring quietly under the tarp. A week later, a post appeared online with the headline, "Beauty grows in the wettest places." Overnight, everything changed. People came looking for her. Not just regulars, but strangers who'd read the article. Tourists with maps, even a local news crew who wanted to film her inspiring story. She turned down the cameras. Too much attention made her uneasy, but she couldn't stop the wave of kindness that followed. Florists downtown offered her leftover buckets. A retired carpenter built her a proper cart with a slanted roof to shed rain. Someone left a box of children's books and a new raincoat for her daughter on her table with a note, "For the girl who watches the pigeons." She cried that night, not from sadness, but from the weight of being seen. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Not for riches or fame, but for stability. For a day when her daughter wouldn't have to wear secondhand shoes. For a morning when she could wake up and not feel like she was one missed sale away from disaster. She opened a shoebox under her bed and started putting coins in it. Not just the earnings, but exact change every time. She labeled it Mia's future, and every Saturday, rain or shine, she stood at her table, arranging flowers with care, offering quiet kindness, and remembering the lesson Auntie had given her, that even the most broken things can bloom again, if someone believes they're worth saving. Life didn't change overnight, but it began to bend, slowly, gently, toward something softer. The little flower cart, once easy to overlook in the rain, now drew people in like bees to clover. They came not just for the blooms, but for the quiet warmth that seemed to rise from the table like steam from a teacup. Word had spread not through ads or loud announcements, but through the kind of talk that happens between neighbors. "You should see her bouquets," or "She saved me a sprig of rosemary last week, said it helps with sleep." She kept her head down and her hands busy. There was no time to get lost in the attention. Rent still came due. Her daughter still needed shoes that fit. But now, instead of counting pennies in the dark, she counted them in daylight, with a little extra left over for milk, for medicine, even for a small bunch of strawberries on a rare good week. One morning, while sorting through a box of donated vases from a closing gift shop, she found a business license application tucked inside a dusty ledger. She'd never thought of herself as running a business. She was just a mom trying to make ends meet with whatever beauty she could gather from the edges of other people's leftovers. But the form sat on her kitchen counter for days, staring at her like a quiet challenge. She filled it out late one night, using the library's free Wi-Fi and a pencil she'd sharpened 3 times. She called it Petals and Promise, not because she was sure of anything, but because she wanted to be. The name felt like a quiet vow, to keep showing up, to honor the trust people placed in her, to give her daughter a life where maybe wasn't the only answer to every dream. Getting the license meant rules, permits, fees, health checks, but also legitimacy. The market manager, who'd once eyed her cart with mild suspicion, now greeted her by name and offered her a slightly better spot near the entrance, under a permanent awning. "You've earned it," he said, and for the first time she believed him. She started waking even earlier, not just to collect flowers, but to visit a community garden on the edge of town. An older man who ran it, his hands gnarled from decades of soil and sun, let her plant a small plot in exchange for helping with weeding and watering. She chose hardy flowers, marigolds that laughed at drought, zinnias that bloomed all summer, lavender that smelled like calm. Her daughter loved coming with her, tiny hands patting dirt around seedlings, proudly announcing, "I grew that." Back at the market, her table began to look less like a last resort and more like a destination. She used mismatched mason jars instead of plastic buckets. She tied bouquets with twine and strips of fabric dyed with beet juice or turmeric. She wrote little notes on recycled paper, for courage or for a quiet heart or simply, "You matter." People started taking photos, not of themselves, but of the flowers, the notes, the way morning light hit the dew on a single daisy. Then came the real test. The city sent out a notice. Vendor fees at the market would double. Starting next month, the cost to hold a stall would jump from $25 to $50 a week. For some, it was nothing. For her, it was half a week's groceries. Panic tightened her chest. She just started saving for winter coats. What if she couldn't afford the spot? What if she had to go back to standing in the rain with no shelter, no regulars, no hope? She didn't want to beg, but she also couldn't stay silent. One evening, after tucking her daughter into bed, she sat at the tiny table and wrote a letter. Not fancy, not dramatic, just honest. She explained how the market had become more than a place to sell flowers. It was where she'd rebuilt her dignity, where her daughter had learned kindness from strangers, where broken things found new purpose. She printed 20 copies and handed them to her regulars the next Saturday. She didn't expect much, but by Monday a petition had appeared online. By Wednesday, over 200 people had signed it. Neighbors, customers, even the owner of the bakery across the street who'd never bought a single bloom but said, "She makes this place feel human." The city council held a meeting. She went, heart pounding, wearing her best coat and holding her daughter's hand. She didn't speak at first, just listened as others talked about how her little cart had become a symbol of resilience, of community care. Then when they called her name, she stood up. Her voice shook, but she kept going. "I'm not asking for a handout," she said. "I'm asking for a chance to keep giving what I can. Flowers, yes, but also hope. And I can't do that if the cost pushes me out." 2 weeks later, the council voted to freeze vendor fees for small local sellers, and they offered her a permanent covered stall. No more chasing umbrellas in the wind. That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She opened a bank account. Not under her mattress, not in a shoebox, but at an actual bank, with a teller who smiled and said, "Welcome." She deposited $127. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And it was safe. She also signed her daughter up for preschool. The program was sliding scale, and with her new license and steady income, she qualified for help. On the first day, she walked her daughter to the classroom, knelt to adjust her backpack and whispered, "You're going to learn so many wonderful things." Her daughter hugged her tight and said, "Will you be here when I'm done?" "Always," she promised. Around the same time, another single mom started showing up at the market, a quiet woman with tired eyes and a baby in a sling. She'd lost her job at a diner and was trying to sell homemade jam, but no one was stopping. One slow afternoon, the flower seller waved her over. "Trade you?" she said, holding out a small bouquet of chamomile and lemon balm. "Your strawberry jam for my flowers?" The woman blinked, then nodded, tears welling. They sat together under the awning, sharing tea from a thermos, swapping stories of sleepless nights and stubborn hope. A week later, the flower seller asked if she'd like to help on busy days for pay, not charity. The woman said yes. Now on Saturdays, two women stood side by side, one arranging blooms, the other stacking jars of jam, while their children played with blocks under the table. People called it the kindness corner. She still woke before dawn. She still salvaged flowers others threw away. But now when she looked at her daughter, healthy, curious, unafraid, she saw not just survival but possibility. And when customers asked how she did it, she'd smile and say, "One petal at a time." The road wasn't easy. There were still weeks when the money ran thin, days when doubt whispered in her ear. But now she had roots, and roots once planted don't let go, even in the hardest rain. 5 years had passed since that first rainy Saturday, and the corner where she once stood shivering under a broken umbrella now buzzed with life. Cars lined the street, not just the usual market-goers in beat-up sedans, but shiny SUVs, out-of-state license plates, even tour buses that paused briefly so passengers could snap photos of the little flower shop with the hand-painted sign, "Petals and Promise." It wasn't a big store, just a narrow storefront with wide windows, wooden shelves, and a chalkboard listing the day's specials. Sunflower bundles, $8, dried lavender sachets, $5, free smile, unlimited. But it was hers. Every shelf, every jar, every potted herb on the windowsill had been chosen, built, or grown by her own hands. She still arrived before sunrise, but now she unlocked a real door instead of dragging a folding table through puddles. Inside, the air smelled of earth, dried rose petals, and the faintest hint of vanilla from the candles she made with leftover beeswax. Her daughter, now in 3rd grade, sometimes came with her on summer mornings, watering the plants in the small greenhouse they'd built out back with help from neighbors and a local hardware store that donated lumber. The business had grown slowly, carefully. She never took loans she couldn't repay, never chased trends. She stuck to what felt true: rescued flowers, homegrown blooms, and arrangements that carried meaning, not just color. When wedding planners started calling, she said yes, but only if they agreed to let her use seasonal local flowers and compost everything afterward. When a big grocery chain offered to carry her dried bouquets in their stores, she politely declined. "I want to see the faces of the people I'm giving flowers to," she told them. Her team had grown too. The woman who once sold jam beside her now managed the shop 2 days a week. 2 other moms from the neighborhood helped with deliveries and workshops. Every hire came with the same promise: fair pay, flexible hours, and no judgment for needing to leave early for a sick child or a school play. People often asked how she did it, how she went from selling wilted roses in the rain to running one of the most beloved small businesses in the city. She never gave a grand answer. "I just kept showing up," she'd say, "and I listened." She listened when a customer mentioned how much her grandmother loved lilacs, so she planted a lilac bush by the side gate. She listened when a teenager said he wanted to learn how to make a bouquet for his mom's birthday, so she started free Saturday morning classes for kids. She listened when an elderly man whispered that his wife was in hospice, so she began delivering simple arrangements to the local care center every Tuesday. No charge, no receipt, just a quiet knock and a small vase of peace. One spring morning, a reporter from a regional magazine showed up with a photographer. They wanted to feature her in a story about everyday heroes. She almost said no. She hated being the center of attention. But her daughter tugged her sleeve and said, "Mom, maybe it'll help other moms like you." So she agreed. The article came out a month later with a photo of her kneeling in the greenhouse, dirt on her knees, braiding lavender stems while her daughter handed her twine. The headline read, "From Rain to Roots, How One Woman Grew Hope One Flower at a Time." Overnight orders poured in, not just from the city but from towns hours away. People wanted her dried flower kits, her handmade cards with pressed petals, even her simple guide to growing zinnias in window boxes. She hired one more person, a retired teacher who loved organizing, and turned the back room into a small packing station. But she drew a line. She wouldn't grow so big that she lost what made the place special. No online megastore, no mass production. If she ran out of something, she ran out. Good things take time, she'd tell customers with a smile. The market streets changed too. More small vendors came, soap makers, bread bakers, ceramic artists, drawn by the energy her little shop had helped revive. On weekends, the block felt like a festival. Music from a street guitarist, the smell of fresh bread, kids chasing bubbles, and always, the quiet hum of people connecting over something real. One Saturday, as she arranged a bouquet of goldenrod and cosmos for a young couple celebrating their first anniversary, she glanced out the window. A line of cars stretched down the block, not idling in frustration, but parked neatly, their drivers walking toward the market with reusable bags and open faces. Some headed straight for her shop. Others stopped to admire the murals painted on the sides of buildings, or to buy lemonade from a kid's stand. She felt a lump in her throat. This wasn't just success. It was community. It was proof that kindness could ripple outward, that one person's stubborn hope could become a gathering place for many. That evening, after closing up, she sat on the bench outside the shop with her daughter, sharing a peach they'd bought from the fruit stand next door. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, colors she'd once tried to mimic with salvaged roses. "Remember when we used to stand right here in the rain?" Her daughter asked, swinging her legs. "I do," she said. "Do you miss it?" She thought for a moment. "I miss how much it taught me, but I don't miss being cold." Her daughter laughed, juice dripping down her chin. "Me neither." Later, as they walked home, no stroller now, just two pairs of sneakers clicking on the sidewalk, she passed the old laundromat where they'd lived. The building was still there, but the room above it was now a yoga studio. She didn't feel sadness, just gratitude. Back at their new apartment, small but with 2 bedrooms and a balcony where she grew mint and cherry tomatoes, she opened her savings account statement. It wasn't huge, but it was enough. Enough for emergencies. Enough for college dreams. Enough to sleep without dread. Before bed, she checked the greenhouse one last time. The marigolds were blooming bright orange. The lavender was ready to harvest. And tucked in the corner, in a clay pot she'd painted with her daughter years ago, was a single rosebush grown from a cutting of one of those first rescued stems. She touched a velvety petal, soft and strong. Outside, the street was quiet, but tomorrow the cars would come again, and she'd be ready with flowers, with kindness, and with the quiet certainty that beauty, once nurtured, never really fades. 10 years after that first rainy market day, the same corner felt alive in a different way, not just with commerce, but with purpose. The little flower shop still stood, its windows glowing with warm light, but today a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Neighbors, regular customers, kids from the after-school program, even the city council member who'd once fought to keep vendor fees fair, all of them holding shovels, seed packets, and wide smiles. She stood near the front, her hands resting on the shoulders of her daughter, now a teenager with the same quiet eyes and steady hands that had once clutched a soggy stuffed rabbit in a rain-soaked stroller. Today her daughter wore a sun hat and held a clipboard, ready to teach the first group of kids how to plant their very own bloom boxes, free starter gardens filled with soil, seeds, and simple instructions, all funded by a small portion of the shop's monthly earnings. This was the next chapter. Not expansion, not profit, but giving back, planting roots deeper than business into the soil of the community itself. As the mayor said a few kind words about resilience and local spirit, she looked out at the faces. She saw the woman who'd bought jam next to her all those years ago, now running her own food truck. She saw the retired teacher who packed orders, the teenager who'd once nervously asked how to make a bouquet for his mom, now a college student studying botany. She even spotted the florist who'd once handed her discarded wedding flowers, now a friend who donated unsold stock every week. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't use a microphone. She just stepped forward, brushed a stray sunflower seed from her apron and said, "I didn't build this alone. You all watered it even when you didn't know it." Then her daughter took over, her voice clear and calm as she showed a group of wide-eyed kids how to press a sunflower seed into the soil just deep enough. Not too shallow, not too deep. "It's like giving it a hug," she explained. "Not too tight, not too loose. Just enough to say, 'I believe in you.'" People clapped. Cameras clicked. But what mattered most wasn't the attention. It was the quiet moment afterward when a little boy with scuffed sneakers tugged her daughter's sleeve and whispered, "Can I grow one for my grandma? She's sick." Her daughter knelt, met his eyes, and said, "Of course you can, and I'll help you every step." Later that afternoon, back in the shop, things settled into their usual rhythm. The scent of dried chamomile hung in the air. A customer browsed the handmade cards while humming along to the soft folk music playing from an old radio. Her daughter wiped down the counter, then paused to sketch a new design for seed packet labels. Bees, suns, and smiling flowers dancing across the page. She watched her for a moment, this young woman who'd grown up among petals and promises, who knew the value of patience because she'd seen her mother wait for blooms in the hardest seasons. That evening, they walked home together, not in a hurry, just enjoying the golden light of late summer. They stopped at the corner store for tamales, the same kind they'd shared on countless tough nights, and sat on their apartment's small balcony, where tomato vines curled around the railing and pots of mint spilled over with green. Her daughter took a bite, then looked at her with that thoughtful expression she'd had since she was 5. "You turned rain into something beautiful, Mom." She smiled, but it wasn't pride she felt, it was awe. Awe that they'd made it. Awe that kindness once given could multiply like wildflowers in an empty lot. "I didn't turn it," she said softly. "I just didn't let it wash me away." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the city, the laughter from a nearby park, the chime of a bike bell, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful but not quiet. Life was happening all around them, full and messy and real. Inside, later, as she washed the dinner dishes, she glanced at the shelf above the sink. There, still sitting where it had for over a decade, were the tiny yellow rain boots. Faded now, one buckle missing but carefully preserved. She hadn't worn them in years, but she kept them as a reminder, not of how hard it was, but of how far they'd come. She thought about the early mornings, the cold hands, the nights of counting coins and wondering if tomorrow would be the day everything fell apart. She thought about the strangers who became friends, the small acts that felt huge at the time, a hot cup of tea, a saved bouquet, a handwritten note that said, "You're not alone." None of it had been glamorous. There were no grand speeches or sudden windfalls, just one choice after another, to keep going, to care deeply, to believe that even broken things could be made useful again. Now, her shop employed 6 women, all of them mothers, all of them building lives with dignity and joy. The bloom boxes would go to over 200 families this year alone. And every Tuesday, without fail, a simple arrangement still appeared on the windowsill of the local hospice. White lilies, eucalyptus, and one sprig of rosemary for remembrance. Success, she'd learned, wasn't about how much you owned. It was about how many lives you touched without expecting anything back. Her daughter came into the kitchen then, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. She handed one to her mom and leaned against the counter. "Tomorrow's the first day of school," she said. "I'm nervous." "Why?" "I have to give a speech in homeroom about someone who inspires me." She looked at her mother, eyes shining. "I'm going to talk about you." Her throat tightened, but she just nodded, took a sip of tea, and said, "Just tell the truth. That's always enough." Later, as she tucked her daughter into bed, no longer a toddler, but a young woman with dreams of her own, she kissed her forehead and whispered, "You inspire me every day." In the quiet dark, she walked back to the living room and opened the small wooden box where she kept important things. Her first business license, a dried daisy from that very first sale, and a crumpled note from a stranger that read, "Your flowers got me through chemo. Thank you." She didn't need money or fame to feel rich. She had purpose. She had love. She had a daughter who believed in kindness because she'd lived it. Outside, the city slept under a sky full of stars, and somewhere in 100 different homes, seeds were beginning to stir in soil, tiny, quiet promises of what might bloom tomorrow. Years passed, as they always do, quietly, steadily, like the turning of seasons in a well-tended garden. The flower shop remained a steady heartbeat in the neighborhood, but life, as it tends to do, kept unfolding in new directions. The daughter, now in her early 20s, had moved out. Not far, just a few blocks away, but still came by the shop every Sunday morning with a thermos of strong coffee and a fresh idea tucked in her notebook. She'd studied environmental science in college, drawn not by textbooks but by memories of kneeling in the greenhouse as a child, learning how roots reach for water even in dry soil. While her mother kept the shop blooming with bouquets and kindness, the daughter began dreaming bigger. What if their little bloom boxes could become something more? Not just seeds in pots, but real gardens, in schoolyards, on apartment balconies, even in empty lots turned into community green spaces. One rainy afternoon, much like the ones from long ago, they sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs, maps and sketches spread between them. The daughter pointed to a patch of cracked concrete near the old bus depot. "This could be a pollinator garden," she said. "Bees, butterflies. Kids could learn here." Her mother listened, not as a parent, but as a partner. She'd learned long ago that wisdom doesn't only come with age, it also comes with fresh eyes. So they started small. They applied for a city grant, wrote a simple proposal, and used their own savings to buy compost, native wildflower seeds, and child-sized gardening gloves. They called it Rooted Together, a program that didn't just give plants, but taught people how to grow them, care for them, and share the harvest. The first workshop drew a dozen people, a retired mechanic, 2 high school students, a young couple with a baby, and an elderly woman who said she hadn't touched soil since her husband passed. They dug into the hard earth behind the community center, laughing as worms wriggled between their fingers, planting milkweed for monarchs and coneflowers for bees. No one expected it to catch on so fast. Within months, Rooted Together had waiting lists. Schools asked for curriculum help. A local hardware store donated tools. Even the city began setting aside unused land for these little oases of green. And through it all, the daughter led with the same quiet grace her mother had modeled. Never loud, always listening, always showing up. Her mother still ran the flower shop, but now she also taught weekend classes on drying herbs and making natural dyes. She watched with pride as her daughter stood in front of groups, explaining how a single sunflower could feed birds, support insects, and lift someone's spirit all at once. One spring morning, as they prepped seedlings for a new garden at the public library, a reporter from a national magazine showed up. They were doing a feature on everyday climate heroes, ordinary people making real change in their communities. The daughter was hesitant. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I just love the earth." But her mother smiled and said, "Heroes don't wear capes. They wear muddy boots and keep planting even when no one's watching." The article came out that summer. It didn't focus on fame or numbers. It told the story of 2 generations, one who learned to survive by selling beauty in the rain, and another who chose to heal the earth by sharing it. Photos showed them side by side, hands in soil, smiles in sunlight, a wall of dried lavender hanging between them like a curtain of peace. After that, letters arrived, from teachers in rural towns, from kids in cities with no green spaces, from grandmothers who wanted to start gardens with their grandchildren. Each one asked the same thing: how can we do this where we live? So they made a free guide, simple, clear, full of drawings instead of jargon. They posted it online, printed copies at the local library, and handed them out with every bloom box. No cost. No strings. Just seeds and hope offered freely. The flower shop became more than a store now, it was a hub. On Tuesdays, neighbors gathered to pack seed kits. On Saturdays, kids came to paint plant markers or learn how to press flowers into cards. And every first Sunday of the month, the mother and daughter hosted tea and trowels, a quiet hour of herbal tea and shared gardening tips where no question was too small.